Most people think they already know the Strait of Hormuz. They know it as a military choke point, a narrow passage of water that can rattle oil markets, naval strategy, and the cost of life far beyond the Middle East. That part is real, but it is not the whole story, because Hormuz is not just a place the world watches. It is a place where people live, on an island of red earth, salt, heat, and wind. A landscape so raw and so severe that it can look less like Earth than like another planet. Here, cliffs the color of rust and blood fall into deep blue water. Salt rises from the ground. Fresh water is scarce. The heat can reshape the rhythm of an entire day. And yet, people did not simply pass through this place. They stayed. They built lives in it. They learned how to read the sea, how to live with scarcity, how to turn harsh land into memory, routine, and belonging. What the outside world sees as tension, they experience as weather, work, habit, and inheritance. That is the contradiction at the heart of Hormuz, a place that carries enormous global weight while still being deeply local. A place where the flow of world energy passes nearby, but daily life is still measured in shade, wind, wells, boats, and the discipline of survival. So this is not only a story about geopolitics. It is a story about endurance, about what human beings build when stability is never guaranteed, about a place the world keeps reducing to crisis, even though it has been teaching the meaning of adaptation for centuries. This is the strait the world depends on, and the island the world has never truly understood. This is where Hormuz stops being an idea and becomes a place. Before the shipping lanes, before the headlines, before the arguments about strategy, there is the island itself, harsh, exposed, and almost unreal. Hormuz does not look like the kind of island people expect to find here. It looks volcanic, wounded, almost planetary. Ancient salt forced its way upward through younger rock, carrying iron-rich minerals with it and leaving behind a landscape stained in deep reds, pale whites, sulfur yellows, and violet tones that can make the island look more like Mars than the Persian Gulf. Cliffs the color of rust and dried blood fall straight into dark blue water. Salt domes rise out of the ground like something unfinished. Nothing about the landscape feels soft. It feels exposed, as if the geology is still speaking. And yet this is not just scenery. The same red earth that shocks first-time visitors has long been part of local life. Known as galak, this mineral-rich soil is used in local food, mixed into sauces and bread, turning the island's geology into taste, memory, and identity. Here, the land is not just something people look at. It is something they live with, work with, and even eat. That is what makes Hormuz more than visually strange. Its real power is not that it looks impossible. It is that people found a way to belong here anyway. Fresh water is scarce, the soil is fragile. Rain and erosion keep reshaping the island. But generation after generation, people stayed, not by defeating the landscape, but by understanding it. So the first truth of Hormuz is not military. It is geological. A red island in blue water, a place so extreme it almost feels unreal, until you realize people have been making a life inside it for centuries. Now the scale of Hormuz changes, because the island may look remote, but the water beside it is anything but. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide. And through that tight passage moves one of the most important flows in the modern world, roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil, carried day after day through shipping lanes only a few miles across in each direction. That is what gives this place its global weight. This is not just a map feature, it is a bottleneck, a narrow corridor through which energy, money, and anxiety all move together. When people in Washington, London, Singapore, or New York talk about Hormuz, this is what they mean. They mean oil tankers, they mean naval patrols, they mean insurance costs, freight risk, market nerves, and the simple fact that when too much of the world depends on one thin passage of water, even a small disruption can send consequences far beyond the Gulf. And that is why this matters to an American viewer, even from thousands of miles away. Because a place like this can influence fuel prices, shipping costs, and the wider mood of the global economy without most people ever seeing it. A threat in these waters can ripple outward into transportation, industry, inflation, and the everyday cost of living. The strait is far away. Its effects are not. But what makes Hormuz more than a geopolitical talking point is the contrast. On one side, supertankers carrying enormous cargoes through a passage the world cannot ignore. On the other, fishermen in small boats, pilots reading currents, and island communities living beside a system of global dependence they did not design and cannot control. For them, the strait is not an abstraction. It is a working environment, a source of danger, and the water around home. That is the real tension here. Not only that the world depends on this passage, but that so much of that dependency rests on a place that has never been fully stable, never been fully simple, and never belonged to the headlines alone. The strangest thing about Hormuz may not be its color. It may be the fact that people here do not just live on this landscape. In a sense, they consume it. To most outsiders, the island's red earth looks like spectacle, something to photograph, admire, and leave behind. But on Hormuz, that same mineral-rich soil has long belonged to daily life. Known locally as galak, it is used in local cooking, mixed into sauces, worked into bread, and folded into flavors that people here do not treat as exotic at all. It is simply part of home. That changes the meaning of the island, because once the land enters the meal, it stops being scenery. It becomes memory, habit, inheritance. A visitor may see a red beach and think of geology. A family at the table may taste the same island and think of childhood, of mothers and grandmothers, of recipes repeated so often they no longer feel unusual. What looks impossible from the outside becomes ordinary from within. That is often the truest sign that a culture belongs to its environment. Not when it praises the landscape, but when it quietly builds daily life around it. And on Hormuz, food tells you something the headlines never can. This is not a place where survival produced a blank, stripped-down existence. It produced a distinct way of living, a way of taking scarcity, mineral, heat, and isolation, and turning them into something textured, social, even generous. Because food is never just nutrition in places like this. It is proof that people did more than endure. They interpreted the land. They found flavor in what others would call barrenness. They turned geology into culture. That is why Hormuz matters. Not only because the world depends on the water around it, but because on this island, even the earth itself was drawn into human life, seasoned, shared, and made part of identity. And once that happens, Hormuz is no longer just a strategic location. It becomes a civilization. If Hormuz were only a story about oil, strategy, and global tension, it would already be important. But the deeper truth is stranger than that. Because even the sea here is living under conditions that should, by ordinary standards, be too extreme to bear. In summer, water temperatures in this part of the Gulf can reach around 96 degrees Fahrenheit. In most of the world, that kind of heat pushes coral toward bleaching and collapse. Reefs lose the fragile balance that keeps them alive. Color fades, growth stops, entire systems begin to die. And yet, around Hormuz and the nearby islands, coral has continued to survive in water that seems almost hostile to its existence. That is what makes Hormuz more than a geopolitical story, because these reefs are not surviving by accident. Over thousands of years, repeated exposure to extreme thermal stress left behind coral communities with an unusual degree of heat tolerance, one of the clearest examples of adaptation under pressure in modern marine biology. These reefs are not just beautiful. They are evidence. Evidence that life can sometimes adjust to conditions that appear impossible from the outside. And their importance is not abstract. The reefs support more than 700 fish species. They shape where fish gather, where nets are cast, and where coastal communities have sustained fishing traditions across generations. What lies below the surface is not just a scientific curiosity. It is part of a food system, a working system, and a human relationship with the sea that long predates tankers, patrol routes, and energy markets. That contrast matters. Above the water, one of the world's most sensitive shipping corridors carries the weight of global anxiety. Below it, a reef system keeps doing something quieter and, in its own way, just as extraordinary: enduring. But endurance is not invincibility. The same reefs that survived centuries of natural extremity now face a different kind of threat, one that moves faster than adaptation can answer. Oil contamination from tanker traffic, runoff from coastal development, and military activity in reef zones place sudden pressure on systems that evolved slowly over immense stretches of time. These corals learned how to survive heat. That does not mean they can absorb every shock imposed on them now. And when reefs like these begin to fail, what disappears is never only underwater beauty. It is habitat. It is fish. It is food security. It is a layer of resilience that took centuries to form and could be broken far more quickly than it was built. So the reefs of Hormuz do not just make this place more beautiful, they make it more revealing. Because in a region the world usually reads through conflict, these corals tell a different story. One about adaptation, fragility, and the narrow line between surviving pressure and finally being overwhelmed. Not all survival in Hormuz happens on bare rock. Some of it happens in silence, in shallow, tidal water, inside a forest most outsiders would never think to call essential. Along the southern and southeastern shoreline of Qeshm, the Hara forest spreads through tidal channels and mudflats in dense stands of Avicennia marina, a mangrove species that solved one of the region's harshest problems long ago: how to live in water so salty it would kill almost everything else. These trees filter salt through their roots and push some of it back out through their leaves, surviving by means of a biological system shaped over immense stretches of time. From above, the forest looks almost abstract, a dark green maze pressed against the blue edge of the Gulf. But at water level, moving slowly through the channels by boat, it feels enclosed, protective, almost secret. Light falls through the canopy in fragments. Birds move through it during migrations that cross continents, and the stillness can make it seem, for a moment, like a place outside the larger pressures of the strait. But the Hara forest is not separate from human life here. It is part of how human life here continues. For local fishermen, this is not simply a scenic wetland or a patch of coastal wilderness. It is a working system. The forest creates the nutrient conditions that support shrimp and fish populations in the surrounding waters, functioning as a nursery for species that later move into deeper water and, eventually, into nets. Communities that have fished these channels for generations learned to work with the forest's rhythms, taking from it without exhausting what it could replace. That is what makes the Hara forest so important. It is infrastructure, but the kind modern economies often fail to notice. No concrete, no steel, no control tower. And yet, it helps feed a sea. In a region the world usually reads through tanker routes and military risk, this forest is doing something quieter and more fundamental. It is supporting food, habitat, and continuity. It is making life possible without announcing itself. And like so much else in Hormuz, it is resilient, but not untouchable. The forest became this dense through long periods of tidal stability. Now it faces oil contamination from tanker traffic, warming water, and more frequent extreme heat. And if a nursery like this begins to fail, the loss is not symbolic. It moves straight into daily life, into smaller catches, weaker food security, and a damaged relationship between people and the waters that have sustained them for generations. So the Hara forest is not just another beautiful corner of the Gulf. It is one of the hidden engines of survival here. A mangrove labyrinth rooted in salt, feeding fish, guiding livelihoods, and reminding us that the most essential structures in a place are often the ones the outside world never learned to see. On Qeshm, heat is not just weather, it is authority. In summer, temperatures can rise above 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity coming off the Gulf makes the air feel less like something you breathe than something you wear. Under those conditions, climate stops being background. It becomes the force that organizes everything. That is why life here does not move by the clock. It moves by the sun. Before sunrise, while the air is still briefly tolerable, the island comes alive in concentrated bursts. Fishermen push their boats out early. Markets open fast. Work begins before daylight fully hardens into heat. There is a narrow window when movement is still possible, and people who live here know exactly how to use it. Then the day changes. By early afternoon, Qeshm does not merely slow down, it stops. Not because people are passive, not because the island is sleepy, but because generations learned a simple truth. Some hours belong entirely to the sun. The wise response is not resistance, it is rhythm. Life returns in the evening when the worst is past, and the island begins to move again with the compressed energy of people who have learned to build their day inside whatever margins the climate leaves them. That rhythm tells you something important about Hormuz and its surrounding islands. The people here did not conquer this environment. They calibrated themselves to it. On Qeshm, houses are oriented to catch the northwest wind. Walls are thick, not for grandeur but for thermal mass. Water is handled with a discipline older than modern infrastructure. Even architecture here is less about style than about negotiation. A centuries-long negotiation with heat so intense that every structural decision becomes, in one way or another, a survival decision. And that is where the emotional weight of this place deepens. Because from the outside, adaptation can look small. A wall built thicker. A market opened earlier. A household using less water. A day cut in half and resumed after dark. But when those decisions are repeated across generations, they become more than habits. They become culture. They become a way of reading the world correctly. Qeshm matters for that reason. It shows what life looks like when heat is not an inconvenience, but a permanent condition. When endurance is not dramatic, but daily. And when survival is not a heroic act performed once, but a quiet intelligence practiced every single day. If Qeshm teaches you how people move through heat, Laft shows you what happens when that knowledge is built into stone. On the northwestern shore of the island, Laft rises close to the water in tightly pressed houses of coral stone and mud brick, their skyline broken by tall wind towers that seem almost too simple to matter, until you understand what they are doing. These towers were not built for beauty. They were built so people could keep living here. Their open mouths face the prevailing breeze with remarkable precision, pulling cooler air from above and guiding it downward through internal channels into the rooms below. In a place where outside temperatures can reach around 122 degrees Fahrenheit, they create interiors measurably cooler by roughly 15 to 20 degrees, without electricity, without machines, and without anything more complicated than air moving through shaped space. That is what makes Laft so powerful on screen. You can look at it and understand the idea immediately. This is not decoration. This is survival made visible. And the deeper you look, the more impressive it becomes. Because these towers are not some abandoned relic from a lost world. They still make sense. They still answer the same problem they were built to solve. The people who shaped them were not chasing elegance for its own sake. They were solving a deadly equation: how to make life possible in a climate where failure was not discomfort, but danger. The wells tell the same story. Laft's 366 ancient wells formed a water system so disciplined it feels almost severe by modern standards. Each well was used only once per year in rotation, preserving limited freshwater reserves in a place that produced very little of its own. That is not romantic ingenuity. It is long-term thinking under pressure. A community designing its future one season at a time. And that is why Laft matters beyond architecture. It reveals something essential about the Hormuz region. People here did not survive by overpowering the environment. They survived by studying it, respecting it, and building in direct conversation with it. Wind became ventilation. Scarcity became system. Heat became a design problem answered across generations. So Laft is not just a village with old towers and old wells. It is a blueprint of endurance, a place where architecture is not about style, wealth, or prestige. It is about whether a family can sleep, whether water will last, whether a settlement can endure another season under a punishing sun. And in that sense, Laft may be one of the clearest truths in all of Hormuz. When conditions are harsh enough, the smartest buildings are not the ones that impress the eye. They are the ones that keep people alive. There are places where water is a convenience, and there are places where it becomes the hidden logic behind an entire way of life. In the Hormuz region, water is not simply one problem among many. It is the organizing scarcity, the condition that shapes the kitchen, the house, the street, the rhythm of the day, and the habits people pass down without always needing to explain them. Because on these islands, rain does not arrive generously. Groundwater, where it exists at all, is often brackish, mineral-heavy, and inadequate for daily use. Fresh water frequently has to be brought from the mainland by barge, bought at a cost that reflects distance, transport, and uncertainty. And once water arrives, it is not treated as something endless. It is measured, watched, stretched, and respected. That changes people, or rather, it trains them. In places of abundance, water disappears into habit. You turn a tap. You rinse without thinking. You cook without calculating. But in Hormuz, scarcity teaches a different intelligence. Cooking methods are shaped by how much water a meal requires. Bathing adjusts to delivery schedules. Even the way a basin is rinsed or a pot is filled can carry a kind of arithmetic learned over generations, not as theory, but as instinct. And that may be one of the most revealing things about this region. Because the deepest forms of adaptation rarely look dramatic. They look ordinary. They look like knowing exactly how much water a dish needs. They look like not wasting what cannot be easily replaced. They look like children, absorbing discipline not through lectures, but by watching older hands move through daily life with care. In that sense, scarcity does not just limit behavior here. Over time, it becomes culture. That is why this part of the story matters far beyond the Gulf. For an American viewer, water stress can still feel like a regional issue, something distant, specific, tied to deserts, islands, and places that seem exceptional. But Hormuz suggests something larger. It shows what happens when uncertainty about basic resources stops being temporary and becomes structural. When conservation is no longer a virtue, but a condition of staying where you are. This is not a future imagined in policy language. It is a future already lived in practice. And once you see that, the region begins to look different. Not poorer, not primitive, not left behind. More disciplined, perhaps, than the modern world knows how to be. Because water scarcity here did not produce surrender, it produced precision. A way of living in which every drop has consequence, every routine carries memory, and survival depends less on grand solutions than on thousands of small decisions made correctly, day after day. That is what makes water in Hormuz more than a resource story. It is a story about character, about what people become when they live long enough with limits that the rest of the world still treats as an emergency. Some knowledge is kept in books, some is kept in drawings, numbers, and plans, and some survives only in the body. Along the boatyards of Qeshm and the Hormuz coast, men still build traditional wooden vessels known as Lenge. Not from blueprints, not from written manuals, but from repetition, memory, and hands that learned the behavior of wood over time. The curve of the hull, the angle of the keel, the placement of each structural piece, none of it begins on paper. It begins in experience, in correction, in having done the work enough times to know how the vessel will behave once it meets the sea. This is not heritage staged for display, it is work. A Lenge is built to carry cargo, to move across open water, to survive Gulf storms, and to handle the shallow coastal conditions that shaped this region's maritime life for centuries. For the men who build them, the question is simple: whether the boat will hold, whether it will move correctly, whether it can be trusted when the water turns rough. The knowledge passes the way working knowledge often does, from father to son, master to apprentice, by watching, repeating, and staying close to the craft long enough for judgment to become instinct. The shape of the boat is learned in the hands before it is ever understood in words. That is why so much of this tradition has never needed writing. It was made to function, not to explain itself. The Lenge belongs to an older trading world. These boats were shaped for local winds, local depths, and the commercial routes that once linked Hormuz to ports across the Indian Ocean. Portuguese records mention them as early as the 16th century. They are still being built today in much the same way. But the space for that work has narrowed. Modern maritime certification standards are difficult for traditional wooden vessels to meet. And sanctions, shifting regulations, and changing trade patterns have made the craft harder to sustain commercially. When that pressure grows, what weakens is not only a type of boat, it is an entire chain of knowledge that exists most fully in practice, in memory, and in the judgment of people who know the sea through labor rather than theory. So, in the boatyards of Hormuz, the old world is not gone. It is still being measured by eye, still being cut into timber, still being tested against weight, weather, and salt water. And as long as these boats continue to take shape in working hands, this coast remains more than a corridor of oil and pressure. It remains a place where knowledge is still built, not only remembered. By the time you begin to understand Hormuz, one thing becomes clear. Almost nothing here was shaped by appearance alone. Not the houses, not the wells, not the boats, and not the clothing. The women of Hormuz developed a style of dress that is among the most striking in the Gulf. Richly embroidered garments in deep gold, cobalt, and crimson, worn in patterns that carry regional and family meaning. To an outsider, it can look purely decorative. But like so much else in this region, beauty here did not begin as display. It began in function, climate, and daily life. The clearest example is the traditional face mask worn by many women on the island. Structured, deliberate, and immediately recognizable, it covers the most exposed parts of the face while leaving the lower face open. In the outside imagination, something like this is often misread before it is understood. But in Hormuz, its original logic was environmental. The Gulf sun, intensified by reflection off salt water, can damage the skin over a lifetime of outdoor work. What later became tradition began as protection. Over time, that protection became language. The mask did more than shield a face. It began to communicate. Its pattern, shape, and construction could signal marital status, regional origin, and in some communities even family lineage. In other words, it became readable, not to everyone, but to those within the culture who knew what they were looking at. Clothing here did not simply cover the body, it carried information. That matters because it changes how this tradition should be seen. Not as costume, not as curiosity, and not as something separate from the harder realities of life on the island. It belongs to the same world as wind towers, wells, and disciplined water use. A world in which survival and meaning gradually folded into each other until function became form, and form became identity. On Hormuz, even beauty learned how to work. But this language too can fade. Younger women in coastal towns increasingly choose other forms of dress, and the number of craftspeople who still know how to make these masks continues to shrink. What is at risk is not only an object, but a way of reading belonging, a visual code shaped by climate, labor, and community over generations. So this part of Hormuz is easy to admire from a distance, but it asks for something more than admiration. It asks to be read correctly, because here, clothing is not separate from the story of survival. It is part of it. And in a place where so much has always depended on knowing how to live under pressure, even dress became a form of knowledge. You do not arrive in Kumzar by accident. The village lies at the edge of the Musandam Peninsula, reached only by sea, pressed between steep rock and water in a way that feels less connected to the modern world than quietly apart from it. That isolation did more than protect the place. It protected a voice. For centuries, ships, traders, sailors, and empires moved through the Strait of Hormuz. Most of them passed on. Kumzar did not. And in the speech of the village, traces of those movements remained. Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, Hindi, and other fragments gathered over time, not in archives or inscriptions, but in daily language, until the people of this coast were speaking something found nowhere else on Earth. Kumzari is not just a dialect surviving on the margins. It is the memory of a maritime world still alive in the mouth. That is what makes the village so remarkable. Not simply its remoteness and not only the beauty of its setting, but the fact that history here was not stored in monuments. It stayed in ordinary speech, in greetings, in names, in the sounds people used at home, on the shore, and across generations. And that fits this region perfectly, because the Strait of Hormuz has never been only a passage for goods or fleets. It has also been a passage for language, influence, religion, trade, and empire. Most of those forces moved on. Kumzar kept the residue. Even the life of the village still follows conditions the outside world does not control. In the most punishing summer heat, when the enclosed bay becomes difficult to inhabit, the community has long relocated together before returning again. Geography still sets the terms. Climate still decides part of the calendar. Life here was never built on permanence in the modern sense. It was built on continuity. But continuity is not guaranteed. The pressure now is quieter than conquest, and in some ways more final. Younger Kumzaris leave for work, school, and wider opportunity. Connectivity reaches farther. Isolation weakens. And when isolation weakens, the small things it once protected begin to thin out. First in usage, then in confidence, then in memory. That is why Kumzar matters so much in this story. Because by this point, Hormuz is no longer only a place of red earth, coral, heat, boats, and salt. It becomes something even more human. A place where history entered daily life so deeply that it changed the language itself. And in Kumzar, that history still speaks. Source details used here. The village is accessible only by sea. Kumzari preserves layers from Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, Hindi, and other contacts. The community relocates seasonally in extreme heat, and the language now faces generational pressure. After the red heat of Hormuz, Musandam changes the air of the film. The color drains out, the space opens, and Arabia begins to look nothing like the image most people carry in their heads. At the western mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, the Musandam Peninsula drops into the sea in a series of narrow inlets and steep limestone walls. A coastline so unexpected that early photographs of it were once met with disbelief. This is Omani territory, physically cut off from the rest of Oman, and it feels that way. Separate, abrupt, almost set aside from the rest of the region. What you see here are drowned valleys. Ancient river cuts were later flooded as sea levels rose, leaving behind dark, still channels that function like fjords, with cliffs rising almost straight out of the water. In calm conditions, the reflections can be so exact that the line between rock and water seems to disappear. It is not a soft landscape, it is a carved one, and the deeper you look, the older it becomes. Marine fossils appear high in the limestone, reminders that this rock was once seabed before it was folded upward by the long collision between the Arabian and Eurasian plates. In Musandam, geology does not sit quietly in the background. It stands exposed. Seashells end up at mountain height. The land itself feels unfinished, as if the argument that made it is still going on beneath your feet. People learn to live inside that broken geography. Communities in these inlets, shaped by fishing, boat travel, and the practical isolation of cove life, historically moved between settlements by water more often than by land. Distance here is not measured the way it is on a map. Two places can look close and still be separated by stone, angle, and access. Over time, that kind of geography creates its own habits, its own rhythms, and even its own cultural distinctions. That is what makes Musandam such an important turn in the story. Up to this point, Hormuz has been red earth, coral, heat, scarcity, and human adaptation under exposure. Musandam widens the lens. It shows that the strait is not only a zone of pressure, it is also a region of astonishing physical variety, a threshold where desert assumptions break apart and Arabia reveals a harder, stranger shoreline. And yet the same larger truth still holds. This landscape too shaped its people by separation, by movement, and by the need to read the coast correctly. Even now, as ferries and recreational traffic reduce some of that old isolation, Musandam still carries the feeling of a place formed in compartments. Coves divided from coves, communities from communities, sea from stone, and the present from an older geological time that never fully went away. So Musandam does more than change the scenery. It reminds us that the edge of Hormuz was never one thing. It was never only a corridor of oil, or one island, or one political flashpoint. It was always a world of thresholds, where continents collided, where coastlines fractured, and where people learned to live inside the spaces left behind. Then the coast changes again. East of Hormuz, after the red earth and mineral weight of the island, Hengam arrives almost like a correction. The boat slows, the light sharpens, and the shoreline turns white. Not the white of resort sand or something bleached by overuse, but a brighter, stranger white made of fine sediment and tiny reflective flakes that catch the sun and throw it back in silver and gold. the effect is immediate. Hormuz feels iron-rich, volcanic, heavy with pressure. Hengam feels open, clear, and almost suspended. The water here is shallow, warm, and unusually transparent. The kind of water that suggests a seafloor still relatively clean and currents gentle enough not to constantly disturb what lies below. After so much of this story has been told in the colors of rust, dust, and stone, Hengam brings in another register entirely: brightness, clarity, and the uneasy beauty of something not yet fully broken. And below that surface, the island holds something increasingly rare in this region. One of the few coral reef systems in the Persian Gulf that has not yet been comprehensively damaged. Dolphins still move through these waters. Fish still gather where the reef remains intact. The island's fishing communities still rely on a relationship with the sea built long before shipping corridors, maritime borders, and modern surveillance fixed this region into strategic categories.
That is what gives Hengam its place in the story. It widens the viewer's understanding of Hormuz, because by now it would be easy to reduce this whole region to one icon: a red island, a narrow strait, a geopolitical flashpoint. Hengam resists that simplification. It shows that the wider Hormuz world is not only dramatic in one color or one form, it is larger than that, more delicate in some places, more exposed in others, and in certain pockets, still holding forms of marine life that feel as if they belong to an older Gulf. But the word here is still fragile. Hengam remained this clear partly because of geological isolation, and because its reef developed in relative shelter from the main tanker corridor to the north. Yet that shelter is thinning. Shipping traffic grows heavier. Vessels grow larger. The displacement they create becomes harder to ignore with every passing season. So Hengam is not a detour from the pressures of Hormuz. It is another way of seeing them. A white shoreline, clear water, dolphins moving through one of the last functioning reefs in the region. And behind all of it, the same question that keeps returning in different forms. How long can something this delicate remain itself when the larger machinery of the world keeps moving closer? Kish does not introduce itself with grandeur. It does something more interesting. It lets contradictions sit in plain view. The island lies in the central Persian Gulf, small enough to cross in a day, and its most recognizable landmark is not a palace, a shrine, or a natural wonder. It is a wreck, a Greek cargo ship that ran aground in 1966 and never left. Decades later, it still sits in the shallows off the northern beach, rusting in place with the stubborn permanence of something that stopped moving and slowly became part of the island itself. And that is where Kish begins to reveal its logic. Because the wreck is no longer just a failed vessel. Coral has spread across the steel. Fish move through spaces once built for engines and cargo. What commerce abandoned, marine life repurposed. That image carries the whole island inside it. On Kish, one system never fully replaces another. It overlaps it, argues with it, lives beside it. Beneath the island, that argument continues in another form. The underground city of Qeshm began as a network of hand-cut kanat tunnels built roughly 2,500 years ago to move groundwater across dry terrain. Today, those passages survive in stone and shadow, with fossilized seashells still embedded in the ceiling. Marine life above, human engineering below, and multiple ages of the island compressed into a single underground space. Then comes the modern layer. After the 1979 revolution, Kish was designated a free trade zone, transforming it from a quieter fishing and pearl diving island into a commercial anomaly with a different economic role from the Iranian mainland. Retail complexes, duty-free ambition, and tourism arrived not as a side note, but as part of the island's identity. And yet the older island did not disappear. That is what makes Kish so compelling. Luxury development stands near beaches where sea life still follows older rules. Reef systems remain exposed to the consequences of nearby economic activity. Tourism, trade, and ecology occupy the same small space without ever fully agreeing on what the island is for. The contradiction is not hidden, it is the story. So Kish becomes something more than a stop in the wider Hormuz world. It becomes a test case, a place where a shipwreck turns into reef, where ancient water engineering survives beneath modern commerce, where an island tries to be marketplace, destination, habitat, and coastline all at once. And that tension feels unmistakably modern. Because Kish is not simply caught between past and present. It is living in an ongoing argument between what can be sold, what can be built, and what still insists on living there anyway. South of Hormuz, the map opens. The narrow pressure of the strait gives way to the Gulf of Oman, and Chabahar appears under a different kind of light. It does not sit inside the chokepoint, it sits beyond it. That alone changes its meaning. In a region where so much trade, energy, and anxiety must pass through one thin corridor of water, Chabahar matters because it offers another route. It is the alternative geography on the edge of a system built around dependence. That is why so many outside interests have looked toward it. India, Iran, Afghanistan, and other international actors have all, at different times, treated Chabahar as an answer to the same problem. Too much of the region's commercial life still depends on a passage that can be disrupted. Chabahar does not remove that pressure entirely, but it shifts the terms. It is the bypass geography provided, and politics has spent decades trying to activate. But Chabahar is not only a strategic idea. The coast around it belongs to the Makran region, pale, dry, exposed, and geologically restless. This is a landscape shaped by the subduction of the Arabian seafloor beneath the Eurasian plate, a slow collision that continues to leave its mark in seismic instability and in the mud volcanoes that rise from the surrounding terrain. They do not erupt with spectacle. They vent slowly, releasing gas and mineral-rich water from depths the flat surface gives no warning of. That gives the whole coast a strange calm. Not dead, not empty, but unsettled. The land looks bleached by sun and time, yet underneath it something is always moving. Pressure never fully disappears here, it simply changes form. From shipping lanes and strategy to geology, fault lines, and a coast that never became as still as it appears. And people have lived with that for a very long time. The Baluchi communities of the Chabahar region stand at the meeting point of several worlds at once. The Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and the Iranian plateau. Over centuries of trade, migration, and contact, that position shaped a culture marked by multiple influences without dissolving into any one of them. For most of their history, the deep-water port now discussed in strategic terms was simply the sea itself. Source of food, route of exchange, and the line along which strangers arrived. That is what gives Chabahar its real depth. It is not just a modern answer to Hormuz. It is an older coastal world now being pulled into a newer strategic one. Ports, corridors, and infrastructure plans may define how states talk about places like this. But beneath that language is something more durable. A rough coast, a long memory of exchange and communities shaped by movement, long before planners turned movement into policy. So Chabahar enters this story as more than an engineering solution. It widens the meaning of the region. It shows that the answer to Hormuz was never only military and never only economic. Sometimes the answer was simply another coast, another opening, another way around the pressure. And on the Makran shore, that possibility has been waiting in the landscape all along. By now, the mistake should be clear. The people of Hormuz are often seen through the wrong lens. Outsiders look at heat, water scarcity, isolation, and constant pressure and assume weakness. They see constraint and think deprivation. They see remoteness and think marginality. But that is not what this region shows. These are not communities stranded beside history. They are communities shaped by it. What looks harsh from the outside has, over generations, been turned into knowledge. How to measure water without waste. How to build with wind. How to work around heat. How to read the sea. And how to carry memory through food, craft, and language. Here, adaptation no longer appears as emergency. It appears as daily life. That is the point the outside world often misses. Adaptation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it becomes so complete that it disappears into routine, into architecture, into timing, into instinct. And once that happens, it stops looking like survival in crisis. It starts looking like culture. That is why Hormuz matters beyond its own geography. The world keeps treating places like this as exceptions, too extreme, too exposed, too unusual to say much about ordinary life elsewhere. But as more of the world begins to face pressure from heat, fragility, and resource stress, Hormuz looks less like an outlier and more like an early lesson. The people here did not wait for stability to disappear before learning how to live without it. So this is the correction before the end. What the world keeps misreading in Hormuz is not desperation. It is discipline. It is inheritance. It is the quiet mastery of people who learned long ago how to remain. At the end of a story like this, the easiest mistake would be to leave Hormuz where the world usually leaves it, at the edge, as an outlier, as a place too strange, too pressured, too exposed to have much to say about ordinary life elsewhere. But that is no longer convincing, because Hormuz is not remarkable only for its red earth, its narrow waterway, or the global weight forced through its sea. It matters because so many of the conditions shaping it, heat, scarcity, fragility, dependence, unstable systems, and the need to adapt without certainty, no longer feel limited to one corner of the map. In the source material itself, Hormuz is framed not as an edge case, but as a preview of a future defined less by stability than by pressure. That is the warning. Not that the whole world will become Hormuz in form, but that more of the world is beginning to recognize its logic. A life shaped by limits. A landscape that cannot be controlled as easily as modern systems once assumed. A community learning to endure conditions that do not ask permission before they arrive. And that is also the lesson. Because the people here did not wait for crisis to begin learning how to live with it. They built relationships with instability long ago. In architecture, in food, in timing, in labor, in water discipline, in language, and in the quiet transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. What they made was never a final solution. It was something harder, and perhaps more durable. A practice of endurance. So Hormuz should not be remembered only as a choke point. It should be remembered as a human answer to pressure. A place where beauty and risk never separated, where fragility did not prevent life, but shaped it, where adaptation became so complete it stopped looking like adaptation at all. And that may be the final truth of this coast. Hormuz is not the exception the world was free to ignore. It is the lesson the world kept postponing. And the question it leaves behind is not whether this place matters. It is whether we are ready to learn from it.